All right, good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to the October meeting of the Boston Region MPO's Transit Working Group. I think we'll get started. We have a packed agenda today, and I'm very excited to hear from all of our speakers and from all of you. My name is Sandy Johnston. I'm a transportation planner with the staff to the Boston Region MPO, and I will be managing the Transit Working Group going forward from now. You'll hear a little bit more about that in a moment. First of all, I'd like to turn things over to our Executive Director, Tegan Tyke, to give a little welcome to everyone. I also want to remind folks that the meeting is being recorded. The recording will be made available on the MPO's YouTube page after the meeting, and you will all, if you registered for the event, receive an email with a link to that recording in case you have to leave early or missed anything. So with that, I'll hand it over to Tegan.
Thanks, Sandy, and welcome everybody. As Sandy said, welcome to this Transit Working Group meeting. And as I hope you know, it is hosted by the Boston Region MPO, or Metropolitan Planning Organization. And Central Transportation Planning staff is the staff to the Boston Region MPO. So there are a lot of familiar faces that I can see in the participant list, but I do like to try to just say a quick hello to welcome you all, and especially anyone new in the room. So while I talk, please feel free to do the thing we usually do, put your, in the chat, you can use the chat to put in your name, your affiliation if you have one, and then where you or your transit service that you're affiliated with is located. And if you share this in the chat while I chat, we can all kind of introduce ourselves to each other. The MPO, the host for this forum, is a body that approves the allocation of federal transportation dollars in what is the Boston region, and that is 97 cities and towns. So the MPO has a board that includes representatives from the MBTA and then other groups that both include or engage other regional transit providers. Again, many of you here are already familiar with the board. And then as staff to the MPO, we, CTPS, we provide planning and technical work in support of the region's goals, and that's to create a sustainable, healthy, equitable, robust, and economically viable transportation system. So if you'd like to learn more about the MPO, you can look at our FAQ, our frequently asked questions, on our website, and I believe someone will drop that link as I am chatting. And then I also just wanted to say that we do like to work with a lot of partners in the region. And so we host this particular forum as one of our ways to convene and discuss really crucial transportation topics. So this forum in particular is for transit providers to bring us all together to talk about the work that you do to build connections, and then also to help draw more linkages between transit providers and the MPO. So you can learn more about this group in particular, this Transit Working Group, in a link that, again, may be dropped in the chat soon on our website. And then with that, I'll just say that I'm very excited for this discussion, and I wanted to say a thank you to our guests that are here today. As Sandy said, we have a packed agenda and some really good speakers. He'll talk about the agenda, but I did want to say thank you to Sarah Klein from SK Solutions and Ellie McCarthy from Rail and Transit, and then of course our friends from our sister regional agency, Metropolitan Area Planning Council, Mara Holland, for covering a lot of the agenda items today. And so with that, Sandy, let me just turn it back to you, and I'm looking forward to listening.
Thank you for the lovely introduction, Tegan. Hi, good afternoon again to everybody, and welcome to those who have joined us in the last few minutes. So I want to take a moment to introduce myself. Although I think many of you know me already, as I said a moment ago, I'm a transportation planner with the staff to the Boston Region MPO. I'm taking over lead management of this group from Michelle Scott, who I want to thank for her phenomenal leadership in getting the working group off the ground and through its pilot stage over the last little bit more than a year. You'll hear a little bit from her about that in a moment. I've been with CTPS for about 4.5 years now, and I've mainly been managing the Unified Planning Work Program, or UPWP. Many of you have heard from me in that respect, and now you'll be hearing from me about this. So just looking at the chat where folks are introducing themselves and the participants list, it looks like we have a great mix of folks, including representatives from transit agencies, other transit operators, municipalities, and other sectors. All of us really appreciate everyone for taking the time to be here today, whether you've attended previous meetings or if this is your first time. So I just want to give a quick rundown of the agenda, which is also shown on the slide on the screen. First, we'll have a variety of quick updates on MPO-related matters that will be of interest to this group. Then there will be an opportunity for transit providers to bring up what they're working on and think others should know about or what they'd like to know. Then we'll have our keynote speaker, Sarah Klein from SK Solutions, from bringing us information straight from Washington, D.C. about the unfolding federal legislative process and what some of the implications for transit may be. We'll hear a little bit from Ellie McCarthy of MassDOT's Rail and Transit Division about that group's innovative grant program for regional transit authorities. Our colleagues from MPC will brief us on the new round of their taxi grant program. And finally, there will be some time for general public comments and then some information about how we will be following up about everything after the meeting. You can find a copy of the agenda on the MPO meeting calendar, and we're going to put the link in the chat. Just want to go over the guidelines for the meeting a little bit. So we can go to the next slide. My colleagues Roisin Foley and Matt Archer will be co-hosting the meeting with me. You may have noticed that you joined the meeting on mute. The meeting host will unmute participants and then mute them again. Please do not mute yourself. If you do, the host will later need to request your permission to unmute you, and this can take some time. If you haven't already, please rename yourself with your first and last name, a comma, and then your affiliation. We encourage you to use the chat box to submit questions and comments. To participate in the discussion, please select the raise hand function. Find this by clicking either on the participants button at the bottom of the screen, and a window will pop up with a raise hand button at the bottom, or the reactions button in the toolbar. We will then call on participants. And for every presentation today, we're going to be doing a Q&A at the end of that presentation. If you run into any technical difficulties during the meeting, you can send a message through the chat, and a member of the staff will connect with you. You can also reach Matt Archer, who's serving as tech support for this meeting, at marcher@ctps.org or 857-702-3708. If you need or want closed captioning, you can turn it on under live captioning in the control menu at the bottom of the Zoom page. You may need to click the three dots that say more. And you'll see many of these instructions and contact information that's repeated on the slides. A couple other details. In general, we'll be prioritizing comments and questions from transit providers during most portions of the meeting, though we will try to get to everyone as time allows. We do have some time reserved for general public comment toward the end of the meeting. The chat will be open, and we will periodically check for questions and comments there as we go through the various sections of the meeting. You may see links mentioned in the various presentations. We'll drop them in the chat as we're able, and we'll also include them in the post-meeting email. And as I mentioned earlier, the Zoom meeting is being recorded, and the video will be available on our YouTube channel after the meeting. You can find recordings of previous meetings on the YouTube page as well. Are there any questions on the logistics? All right, seeing none, we are going to go into our MPO activities update. Let's jump right into that. We have quick updates on several different items. First, I'd like to turn it over to Michelle. She's going to talk about wrapping up the working group's pilot status. But first, again, I really want to thank her for all the hard work she's put into the group to this point. So, Michelle, take it away.
Thanks very much, Sandy, and good afternoon, everybody. My name is Michelle Scott, and I'm a transportation planner and part of the staff to the MPO. So welcome if this is your first meeting or if you've been to many of them before. So as you may have seen on our transit working group materials, like our webpage or some of our documents, this group is currently identified as a pilot. And you can find more information about the history of the transit working group on the MPO website, particularly in this memo that I've just posted in the chat here. But essentially, a couple years ago, the MPO was looking for a new way to engage transit providers in the Boston region about the work that the MPO does and to support coordination between providers that operate in the region to solve some of the kind of collective transit issues that many of you face. And so back in 2019, MPO staff embarked on an outreach effort to learn about the types of needs the transit providers had for coordination and learn about what kind of group format might work for them. And with the MPO board support, the first meetings of the transit working group were held in 2020. And so the group has been in a pilot phase since then, and we're working on transitioning out of that to give the group some more permanent footing, especially after testing out the companion coffee chats to some of these larger transit working group general meetings, which we first tested out back in May of this year. So as part of supporting the transition out of the pilot, we've been, looking back at participation and attendance at our various events and going back through feedback that we've collected through surveys and emails that people have sent us. Back in last month in September, we held a focus group with some transit providers that have been involved and attending transit working group meetings and events to get a sense of their experiences and to learn more about what their experience has been in the group, what we could do to better support coordination between the different transit providers in the region. So right now we're going through this feedback, both from this recent focus group and feedback we've collected since the pilot working group's conception. We do continue to welcome more if you ever have thoughts about what we could do to improve the transit working group. We welcome feedback from any participants at meetings or events through emails, or for example, event feedback survey that you'll be receiving after the event today. And so you can kind of learn more about some of the things we're thinking about, how to improve this group at a more formal report that we plan to do for the MPO board sometime later this fall. These meetings are held virtually, so you're definitely welcome to listen in when that presentation happens. And to learn more about that, when that may be happening, you can subscribe to get notices about upcoming MPO meetings. And we can also send out more information to the Transit Working Group mailing list as that date approaches. So definitely keep an eye out for that. And just to respond to something that Sandy had alluded to, I've been involved in setting up the pilot and testing out some options for the Transit Working Group, but I'll be moving on to some other projects happening at the MPO. So as Sandy mentioned, he'll be leading events and activities related to the Transit Working Group going forward. So he will be your main point of contact for that. I do appreciate, getting to know and working with all the providers in the region, and definitely hope to be involved periodically as the work of the Transit Working Group intersects with some of my other projects. But in the meantime, as we're wrapping up some of these aspects of the pilot, my email address as well as Sandy's email address are listed on the slide there. So if you have additional thoughts or ideas, we're always open to hearing them. And with that, I think I'm going to turn it over next to my colleague, Matt Genova, to talk about the Community Connections Program, and I'm happy to take questions at the close of this larger presentation. Thank you.
Thanks, Michelle. I think we're going to go to Paul Christner first, manager of the MPO's Transit Analysis and Planning Group, to talk about our Transit Planning Technical Service Program.
Yes, thank you, Sandy. I'm Paul Christner, as Sandy said, manager of Transit Analysis and Planning Group at the Boston MPO. Just wanted to tell everyone about our Regional Transit Service Planning Technical Support Program. The Regional Transit Service Planning Technical Support Program stems from the MPO's policy to reduce single occupancy vehicle travel in the region by encouraging use of the transit system. To support that, we offer technical support for issues related to route planning, ridership, cost effectiveness, and other service characteristics. Eligible participants are regional transit authorities, TMAs, municipalities, and MAPC subregions. One note is that the service that we would be helping with would need to be open to the public. At the bottom of the slide, you can see the website, which will have my contact information and some more details about the program. And I would encourage anyone who's interested to take a look, and feel free to get in touch with me for more details about ideas for technical support. It's under the Planning Assistance drop-down menu on our website. If you go there, I'm happy to take any questions.
All right, so we'll do questions at the end of the MPO updates section. Next, I'd like to call on my colleague Matt Genova to talk about the Community Connections Program. Sorry, Matt, I just made you a co-host, so you should be able to unmute yourself.
Cool, just unmuted. Awesome. Thanks, Sandy. And good afternoon, everyone. My name is Matt Genova, and I manage the Transportation Improvement Program, or the TIP, for the Boston Region MPO. So I'm here today to provide you with a brief update on our Community Connections Program, which is funded through the TIP. So the Community Connections Program, as many of you might be familiar with, is one of the Boston Region MPO's 6 investment programs. And those investment programs are the 6 different types of projects that the MPO funds in terms of different transportation projects across the region. So the Community Connections Program specifically funds first and last mile connections and other small, non-traditional projects that help to promote mobility in the region. So this program is funded at $2 million annually in the TIP, with the first round of projects selected 2 years ago, and then the second round of projects selected this past spring. And so we are now jumping into our 3rd round of funding through the Community Connections Program. So eligible applicants for the program include municipalities and regional transit authorities, nonprofits and transportation management associations are also welcome to apply for funding through the program, as long as they do so in partnership with a municipality or an RTA. If I can go to the next slide, thank you. So now that we are finished with our first two funding rounds through the Community Connections Program, we've sort of taken a look back at how the program has performed over the last couple of years and are proposing some changes to the program to create a more streamlined process. So the first change includes moving to a collective purchasing model for small dollar capital projects, which we are proposing to do in partnership with our colleagues at MAPC. So our goal here with these small capital projects is to better define a list of eligible projects for applicants. So things like bike racks and bike share stations, things like transit signal priority infrastructure. And our goal is really to make the application process as straightforward and predictable as possible for all applicants. We are also proposing some other changes to how we handle transit operating projects. So this can be fixed route shuttle or micro transit projects. And we are proposing that going forward, those projects be done either by an RTA or in partnership with an RTA that overlaps the Boston region. And so this change from sort of an open call for any transit operating projects to one that's more focused around the RTAs is really critical to the sustainability of these projects and this larger program in the long run, as it really allows for more manageable project administration through the existing RTA process that's established through FTA. And this change really also supports enhanced coordination between RTAs and other stakeholders on their applications, ensuring that any proposed transit service for funding through this program doesn't duplicate or otherwise conflict with existing RTA service in the region. So these are sort of the 2 different buckets of proposed changes, one to the capital projects and then one to the operating projects that we fund through this program. And I really want to highlight that these changes are not yet final. And the MPO board will continue to discuss these proposals further at the next MPO meeting, which is coming up next Thursday, October 21st at 10 a.m. So the board will discuss these changes a little bit more then, and then we anticipate following up with additional guidance on the program either in late October or early November. So please do be on the lookout for that in the coming weeks. I'll go ahead and stop there, but like Michelle and Paul, I'm happy to take any questions that you all have. And if you'd like to discuss this program further, you're always welcome to reach out to me via email, and we can continue to have those conversations from there. So thank you for having me today, and thanks for your time.
Thank you, Matt. Are there any questions for Matt, Michelle, or Paul? Again, you can raise your hand and we'll call on you, or you can ask the question in the chat. You also are highly encouraged to get in touch with any of those folks offline by email if you have questions for them. All right, seeing none, let's move on to the next item, which is transit provider items. This next item is just to create space in the agenda for transit providers and transportation agencies to make any announcements they'd like to share with the group beyond the main topics of today's meeting. If you do have anything you'd like to share, please raise your hand and we'll call on you or put it in the chat. wait a little bit longer, not seeing anything. All right, no announcements today. There will also be room for public comment at the end of today's meeting. So with that, I think we can move on to our main event today, and I'm actually very excited about this. This is our keynote speaker. We're moving on from the local level to the federal. I'd like to welcome our guest speaker, Sarah Klein, who's been generous enough to lend her time to us for this presentation. Sarah runs her own consulting firm, SK Solutions, in the Washington, D.C. area, and was recently named to the board of the Washington Metropolitan Area Transit Authority, or WMATA. She's spent her career developing and advancing policies to improve transportation outcomes in cities, towns, and rural areas, with a specialty in public transit and transit-oriented development. She led policy development for 2 national nonprofit organizations, Transportation for America and Reconnecting America. Her policy solutions are grounded in the realities of an operating agency. She served as Director of Policy and Government Relations at WMATA. She also spent 8 years working at the U.S. Senate Committee on Banking, Housing, and Urban Affairs as Counsel for Transit Policy, during which time she negotiated the transit provisions of the Surface Transportation Reauthorization known as Safety LU, which I believe was 2 bills ago. And that is the process that is currently unfolding again. Sarah will be sharing with us a briefing on how the federal legislative process unfolding around what many of us know as the bipartisan infrastructure bill and the possibly accompanying budget reconciliation package may affect transit. So she's going to talk for a bit, and then we'll have an opportunity for Q&A. So with no further ado, I will hand it over to Sarah, and thank you again for being here.
Sandy, thanks so much. Hopefully everyone can hear me okay. And I'm going to take a moment just to make sure I can advance slides. Looks like I can. That's terrific. So again, thank you so much for having me today. I'm really excited to talk about what is unfolding in Washington because it has some significant implications for transit agencies and anyone interested in transportation in this country. As Sandy said, I'm Sarah Klein. I'm an independent consultant. My current work on transit outreach and advocacy is on behalf of the Natural Resources Defense Council. So you'll hear me refer a few times in the presentation to NRDC and the positions that NRDC took in the development of this bill. I'm going to talk in some depth about the Infrastructure Investment and Jobs Act, which I have to say does not roll off the tongue the way some of those previous bills have done, like the FAST Act. I'll go in some depth on the transit programs, also touch on some of the other programs. Then I do want to spend a few minutes on the reconciliation bill, which is a totally separate piece of legislation just to add to the confusion. And then I'll talk a little bit about what you can expect in the coming weeks from Congress. So the IIJA, which you may have heard of as the Bipartisan Infrastructure Bill, has the distinction of providing a historic level of investment in surface transportation. You can see on the chart on the right just how great the increase is for highways, transit, and rail programs. And the only thing I'll just note here is that traditionally, in these surface transportation reauthorization bills, intercity rail has not been a large part of the focus. In fact, rail funding typically has moved in a separate piece of legislation and not really been integrated into the overall surface transportation program at the federal level. But with this bill, I think you're seeing a significant commitment to intercity passenger rail, and I expect that probably is going to continue into the future. Another significant piece of the IIJA is that it creates a whole bunch of new competitive grant programs. For those of you who've been around for a little while and paying attention to these bills, about 10 years ago, when the reauthorization bill MAP 21 passed, the focus at that time was to consolidate all the federal transportation programs into as few programs as possible. There was this feeling that the federal transportation program had gotten too fractured. There were too many little programs here and there, and they wanted to bring them all together and make it simpler for everybody to understand and to implement. But I guess that's kind of gone out the window now because this IIJA includes a bunch of new programs, just a few of which are listed on the screen in front of you. These are kind of the biggest ones. And so that's a little bit of a departure from the way these surface transportation bills have worked in the past. And the third sort of interesting thing about this bill is it really didn't include any major policy changes, with the exception of one that I'll mention in a moment. So in the House of Representatives, which also considered a surface transportation bill this summer, known as the INVEST Act, there were a bunch of policy changes, actually, that NRDC was quite in favor of and supported, including a requirement that state DOTs had to fund repair projects before they could fund expansion projects. That's known as Fix It First. There were new performance measures for greenhouse gas emissions and access to jobs. And there was even a new transit program that would have funded service in places that were currently lacking it. But none of these sort of policy shifts were included in the IIJA ultimately. That bill was based on legislation that had been worked up and negotiated in the Senate, and it didn't include these policy changes that the House had pushed for. The IIJA does, however, include certain changes in the environmental review process, which, for full disclosure, NRDC does not support, which are intended to shorten the time frame for environmental reviews. But that's about it for major policy changes within the bill. I'm going to go a little bit in detail into transit, and if folks have questions or want further detail about any of this stuff, I will definitely be happy to take questions at the end of it. So transit in this bipartisan infrastructure bill, an increase of 63% in funding over the baseline amount. And when I say baseline, just because I'm sort of a policy nerd, I always try to define what that is. That's the funding from fiscal year 2021, just carried forward flat for 5 years. So if you take it just carried forward flat for 5 years, it's right here. But if you look at the funding that would be provided by the IIJA, it's an increase of 63%, $107 billion for transit. There are major increases in programs for repair and for expansion, as well as the low-no bus program, which I'll get to in a minute. Similar to the overall bill, there are very few policy changes. It's very similar in terms of policy to the program as we've known it for years. Most of this funding is guaranteed. And you see that I have the quotes there because you can never really say that anything that's passed by Congress is super guaranteed to happen because Congress can always do something later that changes it. But it is supposed to be pretty much guaranteed, except for about $16 billion of it, which is mostly for the Capital Investment Grants Program, that does have to be appropriated annually in future years. And yes, I'd be happy to have this shared afterwards because there's a lot of numbers and stuff, and I don't want you having to take notes as I'm talking. For example, on this slide, this slide, it shows the formula programs in the IIJA. Most of these probably are familiar to transit providers who have been getting funding through these programs for a number of years now. The programs themselves really didn't change too much. But as you can see, they're all getting a bunch more funding. Most of them are getting an increase in the 36% range. And again, these are 5-year funding totals. But a couple of them got a sort of a special bump up. State of Good Repair is increasing a little more and now will include a competitive program for rail vehicle replacements, which is a new feature that will be in that program. The 5310 Seniors and Individuals with Disabilities program also receives a little more of an increase than some of the other formula programs. On the competitive grant side, you have, again, mostly programs that transit providers will be familiar with. Capital investment grants, which includes new starts, small starts, and core capacity, bus and bus facilities grants, and a couple of the other ones. There are 2 new competitive programs that are created that are shown at the bottom there. One is focused on ensuring ADA accessibility at rail stations. And the other is for low emission ferries. Those are both new competitive programs. And the interesting thing in the competitive side is the capital investment grants, the new starts and small starts and core capacity, almost doubles compared to what it was before. There's a significant increase in funding for capital expansion. But even that pales in comparison to the increase provided for the low-no bus program, which is almost a 2,000% increase in funding. That was a very small competitive program on the order of about $100 million a year. And it's now going up to more than $1 billion a year. So this program funds through competitive grants, low or zero emission vehicles and associated facilities and infrastructure. An interesting little provision, though, that kind of got slipped into the bill sort of at the end of the day. And we understand that was done by Senator Toomey, who was a Republican from Pennsylvania. The bill actually specifies that 1.4 billion of those funds must go to non-zero emission vehicles. So there's actually a limit in that program on zero emission, which is primarily electric vehicles. And that 1.4 billion has to go to non-electric vehicles, which is, in my view, a little bit odd. And it's something that NRDC was not happy to see. We thought in a discretionary program, it should be up to the Federal Transit Administration to make those determinations as to what should be funded. So that's the funding side of it. As I said, there are a few modest policy changes, but not a lot, and they mostly are consolidated into two programs. One is the Capital Investment Grants Program, the Small Starts Program, which primarily funds bus rapid transit, streetcars, and other smaller dollar investments. The thresholds for that program were increased so that you can fit slightly larger, more expensive projects, which makes sense because those thresholds hadn't been adjusted for a number of years. And as I'm sure you all know, inflation is hitting hard in terms of construction costs and other costs as well. Another interesting feature that they've created in this bill is that there's now going to be a project bundling program, or a process rather, within New Starts and Small Starts, where a transit project sponsor can actually submit a package of projects. So maybe you have 5 bus rapid transit lines you want to do. You can submit all of them for review and evaluation at the same time. And this, I think, is going to be an interesting and positive development, because I think it'll encourage maybe some systems to be able to think a little more broadly about their full network, as opposed to just one line at a time, which is kind of how we've been building things in this program. And again, I'll answer questions about the other aspects and other changes if folks have questions later, but in the interest of time, the other major area where there's some changes is in transit safety. This applies primarily to areas over 200,000, serving population over 200,000. So the larger agencies have to develop risk reduction plans focused on assaults on transit workers and fatalities and injuries from impact with a bus. And those two things are also added to the reporting requirements for the National Transit Database, which will make it easier to kind of track those issues over time. Interestingly, agencies also must create a safety committee that's composed of equal representation from both management and frontline employees to recommend strategies for risk reduction in these areas. And just a couple of other little tweaks that are in the law in case any of you are in these particular circumstances. When an agency is applying for a zero emission bus grant, again, primarily going to be electric buses, you have to have a fleet transition plan that includes information about how your workforce is going to be trained to operate those new buses. Similarly, a lot of the policy changes relate to electrification of transit and other vehicles, because that I think is the biggest sort of shift that this bill is wrestling with at the moment. So for a transit agency that is doing a joint development project, developing some agency-owned land, if there's a charging station built on that land and private cars get to be charged there, and the owners of those cars pay for that service like they do at a gas station, the transit agency can collect some of those fees. So it's a little bit of a revenue source on those specific circumstances. So that's basically what's in the bill for transit. A lot more money and a few tweaks to try to make some of these programs work a little bit better. And so kind of what should we take from this? I mean, what does this mean for transit? What are the key things we should be thinking about in addition to how we're going to use all this new money, right? So a couple of the takeaways that I had, as I've said a few times now, this is mostly the same programs we've had essentially since 1991, divided into urban and rural, divided into repair and expansion, targeted to particular things like low or no emission vehicles, like elderly and like services for older people and people with disabilities. And I think it's a moment to kind of reflect, are these really programs going to serve us well as we emerge from COVID, as ridership trends may be changing, as technology is certainly changing? I think between now, because this bill is basically done, and the next reauthorization in 5 years, I think it's a conversation that many in the transit industry are already having and are going to continue to have. Just thinking about whether the federal program is really designed to meet the industry and the riders and the workers where they are. Secondly, as I mentioned, this is a historically large increase for capital investments, but there's no increase in operations funding, except for those transit agencies under that 200,000 threshold who can already use some of their federal funds for operations. But for the agencies over 200,000, there's no increase in federal operations funding, and the relief funding that many of the agencies are continuing to rely on in the COVID era is not continued. So this presents to me both a kind of a messaging problem and an actual substantive problem, because the messaging around this bill is there's so much more money for transit, there's going to be so much more transit service on the streets. People are going to expect that. They're going to say to the transit agencies, I think riders will expect improvements, they'll expect more service, they'll expect more frequency, et cetera. But those are things that are covered from the operating budget, and there isn't more operating funding. So where is that going to come from? There was a big push during the development of this bill for an ongoing federal operating program that NRDC was quite involved in. Unfortunately, that didn't get over the line. And so that's an ongoing effort, which we'd love everyone's help with if you're interested, but it is not in this bill. And then the third point that I think it's important to keep in mind is that while this bill provides a historic increase in funding for transit, it also provides a historic increase in funding for highways, primarily through the same programs that have been in place for a number of years, which mostly are basically lots of money flowing out to state departments of transportation, with some going to MPOs, and a lot of discretion at the state DOTs and at the MPOs on how to use those funds. So the question is, this huge amount of funding that's coming out for highway programs now, how is it going to be used? Is it going to be used to repair the roads the buses run on? Is it going to be used to improve circumstances for pedestrians and bicyclists who may use those modes to get to transit stops? Is it going to be used to build wider highways, which tend to encourage more solo driving? We don't know at this point. So the impacts of this bill overall for climate, for transportation, are very hard to predict because so much discretion rests with state DOTs. And just to kind of put into perspective how important that highway program is to the outcomes that we're going to see, you can see in this chart how the total funding for highway programs just dwarfs everything else that's available from the federal government for surface transportation. Highways, by and large, is really the bulk of the program. And so the decisions that are made about how to use those flexible funds are going to be really important to the outcomes. Now, highway programs actually can fund transit. There is eligibility within a number of the programs for transit projects, but transit agencies aren't usually directly involved in making those decisions. It's state DOTs and MPOs, and in some places there's good coordination and some funding gets used for transit, and in other places, not so much. So that is something to keep in mind as this additional funding comes down to states, MPOs, and transit agencies. Now, I want to say a little bit about the multimodal programs, because this is another actual sort of shift in the federal transportation program. It has in the past been quite siloed: highways, transit, a little bit for rail. We're getting to see more and more programs that are open for all of those types of modes. This was kind of spearheaded by the Tiger program, which you guys are probably familiar with because it's been around for 10 years now, amazingly. But it was basically a precedent-setting program because it was really the first one where you could take almost any type of surface transportation project and go to the same program for grants. So this bill builds on that Tiger program. It breaks it into two. One is the one that you see on the top there, National Infrastructure Project grants, is for really big projects, bigger than $500 million. And then the one underneath, Local and Regional Project Assistance, is basically the Tiger program, which is now known as RAISE. One little twist in the National Infrastructure Project program, for some reason, and we don't know why, and we tried to find out and we tried to fix it, we being NRDC, but weren't able to. Transit is only eligible for those funds if the transit project is part of a highway, bridge, freight, or rail project, not as a standalone. I don't know why that is. It's annoying to me that that is the case, but there we are. The program at the bottom is a completely new program, and it's not competitive. It's not like Tiger or RAISE where you do your application, you submit it directly to DOT. It's actually a formula program to state DOTs. So that $6 billion is going to go out across the country. State DOTs then will have to decide what projects to spend it on. And it seems to me it's a great opportunity for transit because transit is such a great way of reducing emissions. And that's the purpose of this program. There are a few other multimodal programs, less kind of directly relevant to transit, but possibly related to some specific needs folks might have. The first one has to do with resilience to protect and mitigate against natural disasters. The second one has to do with equity and reconnecting communities that have been cut off by highways over time. And then there's a tiny little congestion relief program. It's funny to me to say 250 million is a tiny amount, but in the scope of what we're talking about, it is. That's really for technology and innovation regarding congestion management and explicitly includes mobility services, including express transit and microtransit. So that might be another place to look if you have innovative ideas about how to kind of improve some of these situations with innovative transit services. So that was a whole bunch of information about what's in the bipartisan infrastructure bill. And we'll get back to it, but I do want to spend just a minute on the reconciliation bill, which, as I said, is a completely different bill, which makes everything very confusing when there's two infrastructure bills moving through Congress at the same time. So the bipartisan bill is, as its name suggests, bipartisan. The reconciliation bill is being put together and expected to be passed by Democrats only through a special process. So this bill, in addition to some transportation programs, and I've listed out the four main grant programs that this bill has a whole bunch of other Democratic priorities relating to healthcare and childcare and community college and a number of climate-related provisions that don't have to do with transportation specifically, looking at power plants and things like that. So there is a whole bunch of stuff in this bill besides transportation. The transportation pieces of it, which I'll go into in a minute, I happen to think are quite creative and interesting. Unfortunately, the bill itself is now being sliced and diced because it is originally it was put together as a $3.5 trillion package, but moderate Democrats in the Senate have insisted that that's too much, and they're trying to negotiate it down to about $2 trillion. So it's not clear whether the transportation programs that are included in there are going to survive. So I was hesitant to even kind of raise people's hopes by talking about them today, but I do think it's important to know what's kind of on the table. And if you feel so inclined as to reach out and express support for these programs, then that's something folks can choose to do. So one of the reasons that the reconciliation bill is so important for transit is that transit was actually shortchanged in the bipartisan bill. When that agreement, that bipartisan agreement was announced at the end of June, transit was slated to get $49 billion above the baseline. So the way it's calculated is a little weird. I know I was talking about there being 107 billion before, but holding aside, it's like extra money. Transit was supposed to get $49 billion of extra money. But when the bill itself actually came out on July 7th, transit only got $39 billion of extra money. And in fact, transit was the only transportation program that got cut between June 24th and July 7th. So that was pretty upsetting. And fortunately, that $10 billion was restored in the reconciliation bill. And it's a very interesting grant program that this bill creates to spend that $10 billion on basically, as you can see there in the eligible projects list, pretty much any transit purpose you can think of. So it's a very broad program. So again, reconciliation, just holding aside all the other priorities, healthcare and childcare and housing and energy and all that stuff, for transit is important because it restores that $10 billion that was cut. So what's going to happen? Now, that's the big question. And when Sandy originally reached out to me to say, can you speak in October, we both, well, I can't speak for Sandy. I thought we would be done and I would be saying, here's what passed. But we're not in that situation. The FAST Act expired on September 30th, and there was a whole kerfuffle as there was a one-day shutdown of the Federal Highway Administration because its authorization had expired. But now those programs, the FAST Act programs, have been extended through October 31st. So we have a little more time to figure this out. The bipartisan bill, the IIJA, has passed the Senate, and it's waiting to pass the House. The challenge that the White House and the House and Senate leaders are facing is that they sort of have three factions to deal with. They have the Republican caucus in the House, progressive Democrats, and moderate Democrats. So the Republicans actually supported, the sort of Republicans as a whole by and large, generally supported the bipartisan infrastructure bill. It's bipartisan, right? It had some Republican support. But now that the bipartisan bill is kind of wrapped up in the whole Biden infrastructure agenda and people are confusing it with reconciliation, the Republicans in the House have been hesitant to support it because they feel like it's advancing Biden's agenda and that they would be seen as supporting that overall Biden agenda that includes all those climate and other priorities. So the Republicans in the House aren't necessarily supporting what was a bipartisan bill in the Senate. At the same time, you have progressive Democrats in the House who would probably be fine with the bipartisan bill, but they also want reconciliation and they're not willing to vote on one without the other. So the moderate Democrats, who are basically fine with both reconciliation and the bipartisan bill and don't necessarily care which one comes first, there's not enough of them to pass either one of those bills by themselves. So this is the challenge that the House faces in passing that IIJA bill. Now, this leads to a couple of possible outcomes. Both of the boxes on the left assume that both bills pass. Either they pass by October 31st and we're done, or there's more shenanigans and more negotiations and it takes more time, but they both eventually pass. If that happens, that is the most possible funding for transit that's coming out of this Congress. It also includes other things, as I've talked about, a lot of funding for highways, funding for climate, funding for other priorities as well. But just in terms of the transit lens, that's where the maximum funding would be if both of those bills pass. On the upper right, there's the possibility also that the bipartisan bill could pass. It had bipartisan support. It's pretty much set. And then perhaps reconciliation falls apart and the Democrats aren't able to pass that. That would still provide a significant amount of increased funding for transit. That's all those numbers I went through earlier. And so, that we'd lose some of the other priorities related to climate and energy. But there would still be an increase in funding for transit. And the box on the bottom right, you never know. It is always possible that everything falls apart. We don't get any of these bills, and you just get a flat extension of the FAST Act, and we're just kind of, right where we've been. I personally don't think that's going to happen. I think too much political capital is tied up in getting an infrastructure bill done. So I do think there's at least one of those other options that's going to come to pass. But, I can't guarantee, as I said earlier, you never know. Now, if these bills pass, just turning to the real kind of next steps for a moment, a lot of work is going to fall on the U.S. Department of Transportation, like way more than they've ever had to do in the past. There are 4 basic things they're going to have to do. They're going to have to get out way more formula dollars than they've ever done before. That's not necessarily a super huge increase in work because it's basically the same programs, but there's more dollars, more monitoring, more oversight needed. They're going to have to develop criteria, evaluate awards, and then oversee those competitive programs. And that is a lot more work. And there's a lot more of those programs. They're going to have to issue new rules and guidance. And then there's actually some requirements that they do some studies and research and commissions and task forces and working groups and all those sorts of things as well. So they are going to have a lot on their plates. So, the question then is sort of, what is the role of transit providers and other stakeholders who are interested in these programs working well? Well, I think first having a little patience with USDOT as they try to get their thoughts in order and all these things. On the formula funding, transit agencies too are going to, I think, have a bit of a struggle in getting all that new money out the door rapidly. That's going to require some time to sort of build up the staff, the procurement team, the program management team, everybody to really put those funds to use. It's not going to be kind of a turn on the dime kind of thing. So with regard to formula funding, getting the transit formula money out the door and spending that as you choose to spend it for those who on the call who are transit providers. But I would also say, don't forget to coordinate with state DOTs and MPOs on those formula programs that have transit eligibility, particularly that carbon reduction program that I mentioned. That's money that's going to state DOTs. They have to figure out what to do with it. Talk to them about what transit projects might be appropriate for that funding. Similarly, with regard to competitive programs, transit providers can certainly apply on their own, but I think also coordinating with other agencies and entities within your region makes a ton of sense for those competitive programs. And then with regard to the rules and the research, there's usually a public comment process associated with those. So that's a good way to get involved. And if you're part of a membership organization like APTA or Community Transportation Association or others, they're usually pretty good at compiling and putting things together into industry responses to those sorts of things. So that was a ton of information about what's going on in Congress, what's in the bill, what might happen next. And I know there've been a few questions in the chat, which I haven't been able to read while talking, but I'm happy to answer any questions now.
Thank you, Sarah. That was a phenomenally informative presentation covering a huge amount of information and not actually a huge amount of time. So thank you. We will start with the questions we got in the chat, and then I really do encourage folks to raise your hands if you have any other questions you want to speak out loud, and Matt or Roisin will call on you. So we got a couple questions from Franny. One of the questions was, what ways are there to mandate transit on congested highway routes? So does these bills provide any avenues for, I think, ensuring that if money is spent on highways, that it does include some transit element?
So this bill is not about mandating anything, pretty much. There's sort of the program categories that I talked about. But within the program categories, particularly on the highway side, there's a great deal of flexibility. So there is not, I'm trying to think of if there's any counterexamples, but I can't think of one right now. These are decisions that are going to be made at the state and regional level as to what amount of transit support or transit lanes or any accommodation for transit or anything is going to go into road projects. If you're using transit funding, yes, then you have to have transit. If you're using the carbon reduction funding that I was talking about, it would be hard to, in my mind, to do a project under that program that is supposed to reduce emissions that does something on a roadway and doesn't include some transit accommodation, but I'm sure there's a way to do it. So this bill is really not about mandates. And I think that that's a discussion that's really going to play out across the country in a lot of local and state decisions.
Thank you. And Brandy also wanted to know how this funding could relate to efforts to build the North-South Rail Link, which is one of our long-term goal, big projects here in the Boston area. But I think in general, that could be a question about how does this funding relate to kind of mega projects and big regional, state, local priorities for very, very large projects?
Yep. So that's a great question. And the bill is actually fairly positive for that sort of effort. And actually, I'm sorry that I don't know is whether the rail project you mentioned qualifies as commuter rail or intercity passenger rail.
It's a little bit of both. What it is building a tunnel between north and south stations to link the two halves of the commuter rail system, but it would also allow extension of the Northeast Corridor toward Portland and toward New Hampshire. Yeah, that's super cool. So that program that I mentioned in the multimodal section, the national, what was it called? National Project Assistance Program, $5 billion, and it's specifically for projects that cost more than $500 million. And I suspect this would. And it also is probably going to look for projects that don't fit neatly in other categories. And I think, like we just talked about, this one doesn't. In addition, it's going to look for projects that are going to make a significant economic impact, not just in the local region, but sort of for a broader region, which it sounds like this would. So that would be a place to look for that project, as well as other projects across the country that are like that. There's also just, as I mentioned, so much more funding for new starts. So to the extent that parts of that project qualify as commuter rail, that new starts might be a place to look. I didn't go into the intercity passenger rail program, but there are big grant pots specifically for intercity passenger rail. And I'm trying to remember now if they come through the states or if I think they're like competitive programs that states or Amtrak or transit or rail authorities can apply for. So that's another place to look. So there's quite a few opportunities in this bill for those big projects to get done. But of course, these big projects are expensive and the money's not unlimited. So they will be competitive, but there are still some new places to look for that funding. All right, thank you. On a slightly different note, I think Wig Zamor wanted to know a little bit about the bus rapid transit elements and questions about whether that's going to mandate or incentivize in some way 100% electric buses. So do we know, given that there is funding here for electric buses, even if they're not fully electric buses, thank you, Senator Toomey, some of them is there going to be a link between that program and the grant programs for new bus and transit infrastructure, such that, say, a new BRT project would be incentivized to use electric buses?
I love that question. I'll tell you why. So there's two things I love about it. One is it points out just how disconnected some of these programs are from each other. So the new starts and small starts programs that fund bus rapid transit, new bus rapid transit lines or extensions of fixed guideway bus rapid transit is I think has in the past been viewed pretty much entirely separately from the low no emissions program, which was a tiny program in the past. Now that it's huge, I think that's a great idea. FTA should totally encourage some cross-fertilization between those two programs so that there would be that incentive that maybe you get extra points or whatever in your new starts evaluation if you do that. But there's nothing in the bill right now says that. I just think it's a great idea. And it's going to be up to FTA and project sponsors to figure out how to make that work, because there's nothing specifically in the bill to incentivize electric vehicle use in the New Starts and Small Starts program. However, at the same time, and in fact due tomorrow, FTA is asking all stakeholders for comment about its New Starts and Small Starts program and the way that it evaluates projects. And one of the things that NRDC has recommended is that projects that use 100% electric vehicles or 100% zero emission should actually get extra credit in that program, so that there would be an actual incentive. And FTA can do that through regulation. They don't have to have the law saying that they have to do it. They can actually do it on their own. So watch, I would say watch for both the rules that FTA is going to put out about that low-no program, and see what incentives they have for folks in there, but also just watch the rules of how FTA is going to change their New Starts and Small Starts evaluation process separate from the law, because I think that incentive might end up being in there as well.
Thank you. That was very informative. On a similar vein, I think Judy Shanley wanted to know about any messaging about coordination across DOTs, MPOs, and local DOTs, and whether there's any incentive for them to coordinate with human services, transportation entities, and other state and local agencies. And I think we can also generalize that to ask about, do any of these initiatives really try to create new coordinations or new cooperations between government entities and nonprofits, or between government entities at different levels?
So there is currently an existing, I think it may be considered a pilot program at FTA to encourage human services, coordination between human services and transportation providers, which has a small amount of funding each year, and it goes out through competitive grants to agencies or places that are trying to do innovative things in this regard. So I encourage you to check that out. If you haven't seen it, you probably have seen it, but if you haven't, it's there, and it's continued in this bill, even though I didn't call it out because it's a small program and it wasn't changed at all, but it is continued in this bill. So that focus that FTA has on human services, transportation, and that coordination will continue. I would say that for the rest of the bill overall, the law itself is not going to change the way that entities coordinate with each other. Some of these new grant programs do require that, like, you have to coordinate, like the carbon reduction program that I mentioned. It's a state formula program, so the state DOTs control that money, but it does say that a state that's going to spend money in an urbanized area has to coordinate with the MPO in that urbanized area, which kind of makes sense. And isn't probably all that different from other state-run programs where they're spending money in an urban area. They're supposed to coordinate with the MPO. So it basically resting on the same kind of coordination expectations that the program has been resting on. There's not something to encourage further coordination, but that's not to say that further coordination can't happen or shouldn't happen, because with this much money on the table and this much flexibility, I think increasing that coordination is going to be important. Unfortunately, there's nothing really in the bill to incentivize it other than more money on the table.
Okay, thank you. Money does talk. At least in this case, we can hope. So we have a question from Ben Mueller, MassDOT District 6. Are there any specific strings attached to the new and expanded discretionary grant programs to increase the potential for equitable distribution across states, or will the framework be developed by US DOT?
That's an interesting question. I don't think there's anything in the law to relate. Actually, I'm taking that back. Some of those big new discretionary programs, and I cannot remember if it's both the national one and the local one, or if it's the carbon reduction program. I'll have to get back to you with the details. There's one or two of the discretionary grant programs that do say like 65% of this has to be spent in areas over 200,000, the next, 30% is in 50 to 200,000 and 5% in under 50,000. There, one or two of the programs do kind of lay out that certain amounts of the funding have to be spent in certain parts of the state. But I honestly cannot remember which programs those are. And I don't think that's the majority of programs. If the law doesn't specify that, it may, I don't know if USDOT will specify that either. They might, or they might not. So I may have to get back to you with more detail on that one.
All right, thank you. I don't see any more questions in the chat, and I don't see anybody with hands raised. We'll give it another minute if anybody wants to submit any more questions. Again, you can raise your hands in the participants menu or use the chat to submit a question for Sarah. Her email is also displayed on the slide, and we can also throw it in the chat in case anybody. Sarah, are you okay fielding emails about this afterwards?
Oh yeah, absolutely. And I'm gonna hang around a little longer during the meeting as well. If anything occurs to anybody, feel free to chat me.
Excellent. I see a question from Brian Kane. Somebody wants to go ahead and unmute him. Sarah, Brian is the Executive Director of the MBTA Advisory Board.
Brian needs to be unmuted.
I think you're unmuted, Brian, but we can't hear you.
How about now?
Yep.
Hey, there you go. I got three options, and it's always one of three. Thanks, Sarah. Really, really amazing how much stuff you can cram into a discussion. Any movement on anything you're seeing around relaxing provisions of the Buy America Act for large transit systems purchasing things like rail cars? Thanks.
Yeah, good question. And yes, and I apologize to everyone on this call for having packed so much information into those slides. Yikes. I'm glad Annie's going to make them available afterwards. I did, as I was going, I've been through the bill a couple of times now, and I do not recall there being anything on Buy America, either to relax it or to strengthen it, which has also been a push that Congress has been doing in recent years. I can double check that. Just to be sure. I'm happy to follow up on that, but I think that was left alone in the bill.
All right, excellent, thank you. And Judy just threw the links to the FTA grant program that Sarah mentioned in the chat. So in case anybody wants to take a look at that, we will also try and remember to include those in the post-event email. All right, any final questions? All right, thank you, Sarah. This has been super informative, and we may even bring you back to talk to the MPO board. We'll see. It's been really good. Great, thank you.
Thanks a lot, everyone.
All right, so moving right along, I'd like to welcome my colleague Ellie McCarthy from the MassDOT Rail and Transit Division to give us an introduction to their RTA discretionary grant program. We intend this to be the first of several presentations. Today, Ellie will give an overview of the program, and at future meetings, she'll come back to talk about specific projects funded through this program. So Ellie, I believe I made you a co-host, and you should have control over slides and everything, and feel free to go ahead. We cannot hear you, Ellie. Still no.
How about now?
There we go.
There we go. Well, thank you very much. So today I'll give a very quick overview of the RTA discretionary grant program. This is a state-funded program for RTAs that provides operating funds to allow them to test innovative solutions to local mobility challenges. More specifically, that means that the program provides targeted operating assistance, specifically for like technology improvements, service evaluations, program redesign for RTA projects that align with the recommendations from the 2019 RTA Task Force report. I did link the task force report there in case you're curious to know more about it. I could probably spend a good 20-30 minutes talking about that, so I'll just let you review if you're curious. But there were a number of recommendations that came out of that report that we have since designed the program to allow RTAs to test along those lines and pilot innovative projects. So the funding is provided through the Mass State budget. It's typically provided through outside sections as additional operating assistance to RTAs. In FY19, MassDOT had available up to $4 million in operating funds to distribute, while in state fiscals 20 and 21, there was $3.5 million available. There were no discretionary funds included in the current state fiscal 22 budget. MassDOT has been able to augment some of this operating funds with capital funds as well. The program is competitive with the RTAs submitting applications to MassDOT each year. RTAs with projects chosen for award are required to enter into an MOU with MassDOT, which outlines all of the reporting requirements, the scope of the project, and performance indicators that the RTA and MassDOT will use to gauge success of the project. Next slide, please. So through the discretionary grant program, MassDOT has funded a wide variety of innovative projects and pilots, a few of which I'll describe today. I think one of the greatest successes of the program has been the ability for RTAs to pilot various microtransit solutions across the state through the purchase of either microtransit software, a turnkey operation, or even through the development of an in-house application. Some of the software applications include the FRTA Access Program, the Get Your Go program, and the MART subscription program, where each of the RTAs use the funds to purchase the relevant software that they needed to deploy the microtransit system. While others used a turnkey operation such as WRTA and VIA's partnership, where they used VIA vehicles with WRTA branding. Interestingly enough, CCRTA and MWRTA, the Smart Dart and Catch Connect service, are both in-house developed programs where the grant funds were used to design, test, and deploy the app itself. We've also used the funds to fund several marketing campaigns, such as NRTA's year-round service campaign. In 2019, the town of Nantucket decided to fund year-round service on the island, where previously only seasonal summer service was operated. And NRTA used their discretionary award for various television and radio ads, as well as flyers and promotional materials to get the word out around the island to the year-round population. Several RTAs have also been awarded funds to pilot evening service and intercity express service, or to test route enhancements and adjustments such as increasing frequency or adding additional buses to busy routes, as well as to test new online paratransit trip reservation systems to implement same day or next day trip requests for their ADA customers. And the last example we have is the creation of automated fare options, such as BAT and PVTA's partnership with Bytemark to create mobile ticketing options for their customers. And next slide, please. That about sums up my very, very quick overview of the program. I'm happy to answer any questions, and also if anyone is curious to know more about specific projects, as Sandy mentioned, I'm happy to come back and sort of talk in more detail about different types of projects that we have funded through this program. I also have a good amount of data that I'd be happy to share if anyone is curious. My contact information is there on the screen.
All right, thank you, Ellie. All right, so yeah, same deal as before with Sarah. If you want to ask a question out loud, you can raise your hand in the participants menu. Otherwise, you can put it in the chat and we'll call on you. Give it another minute. All right, we have a question from Jennifer Glass from Lincoln in the chat. Is there any chance the state could choose one mobile ticketing system as many people travel across systems? Also, any chance that it could be linked to Easy Pass and include parking garages?
I believe that question might be slightly above my pay grade, although I know that that is something that the RTAs have discussed a lot, and we discussed a lot during the RTA task force days as well. I don't know if I exactly have an answer for you today, although I'd be happy to take this back to the RTAs and see their thoughts as well.
Yeah, I will just add that from what I've heard, there's a lot of discussions happening on that general kind of systems integration topic, but no decisive progress as of yet. Any other questions? All right. Of course, you can always get in touch with LA offline as well. So, we've got a question. Do all of the RTAs use the same tracking system for rides, or does it vary by system? From Marissa.
It definitely will vary from system to system. They all have, some RTAs use the same operating companies, others use different ones. So it's definitely not going to be as uniform across the board.
Thank you, Ellie. All right, I think Franny is typing out a question. A couple of questions, great. All right, so Franny says, during the commission meetings, we heard about PT1 trips to the Human Services Transportation Office. And I wonder if any interagency coordination happened from that. Ellie, do you know if the RTAs have talked about that amongst themselves at all?
They have been talking about that amongst themselves. I know that there is a new task force that's out there that is revolved around the HST question, where several of the RTAs, I believe, will be participating in that. I personally don't have any information to provide today.
All right, so stay tuned. All right, and a question from Christine. Can you quantify where the RTAs are with electrification, including potentially hydrogen fuel?
They are in varying stages. There are some RTAs who have progressed much further along than others. Right now, MassDOT is working with the RTAs on a study to update a study that was completed several years ago about BEB transition for RTAs. So the results of that study should be available, I think, within the year, although I'm not entirely sure. But the goal for that study is hopefully to give the RTAs an actual roadmap on how they can begin the electrification process. Oh, I don't think any of the RTAs have delved into hydrogen, to my knowledge.
All right, any more questions out there? All right, well, thank you, Ellie, and we look forward to hearing from you more in the future. With that, I would like to turn to our last presentation of the meeting. I'm going to turn things over to Mara Holland of our sister agency, the Metropolitan Area Planning Council, or MAPC. And Mara, let me just make you a co-host so that you can unmute yourself. All right. And she's going to talk about the upcoming round of their grant program for taxi and similar services.
Hi, everyone. My name is Mara. I'm a transportation planner at MAPC. I am going to share my screen. It looks like, Sandy, you might have to stop sharing your screen.
We have our slides, your slides in this presentation. If you want to just click, you want to just control.
Oh, great.
Here? Yeah.
That sounds good.
Yeah. So I think you should be able to click at the bottom of the screen there.
All right, Mara, sorry about that. Yep, you should be good to go.
Oh, there we go. Okay, great. This is a new feature of Zoom for me. So as I mentioned, my name is Mara, and my colleague Travis and I, who's also on this call, Travis Pollock, is a senior transportation planner at MAPC. And we have been co-running the Taxi, Livery, and Hackney Transportation Partnerships Grant Program since the spring of 2020. This program was actually designed pre-COVID, and it just so happened that we were ready to roll it out as COVID was becoming a significant issue in our region. So I'll talk to you a little bit about the program first. So the original fund for this program was created as a result of the Act regulating transportation network companies, which was adopted in 2016. And this act had two goals. One was to create a framework to govern ride-hailing services like Uber and Lyft, also known as TNCs. And it was also designed to assist more traditional transportation businesses such as taxis, liveries, Hackney companies. And the way it works is that the state collects a 20-cent fee on all TNC rides. So if you go out and take an Uber or a Lyft ride, 20 cents of that fee goes to the state fund. 1/4 of the total fund goes to mass development, and 1/3 of the total funds that mass development receives goes to MAPC for the operational subsidy program. The other 2/3 goes to mass development to run the business support program, which is also for taxi, livery, and Hackney businesses. So the 1/3 that MAPC gets, we distribute the funds to grantees to partner with taxi, livery, and Hackney companies. And our grantees include municipalities, regional transit authorities, health and human service agencies, as well as nonprofits. And all right, let's go next. So we'll talk a little bit about our urgent program. I believe we came to talk to this group last year about the urgent program. So I'll go through this one kind of quickly and spend a little bit more time on our present program. So as I mentioned, this program started in the spring of 2020. It was really to address urgent needs. It was restrictive to the types of populations that it could serve and the types of trips that it could run. And during this grant program, we did not have nonprofits eligible. We made nonprofits eligible as a result of talking with the taxi industry after this program started, and they wanted to work with more nonprofits. So the second round has nonprofits eligible. For the urgent grant, we had 25 grantees, received just a little over $1 million. And all of these grantees then partnered with taxi, livery, and Hackney companies to provide services that include things around food access, access to non-emergency medical transportation, transportation needs of the homeless, etc. And here's a little bit of a screenshot of what this first program helped to fund. So the program provided over 32,000 trips and deliveries. It served over 17,000 people throughout the state. And it helped to fund and work with over 50 taxi, livery, and Hackney companies throughout the state. So any municipality, regional transit authority, or health and human service agency throughout the state was eligible for this grant. And we had a range throughout the state that participated in our program. As you can see, the biggest single group was non-COVID, non-emergency medical trips. So this included things like dialysis, cancer treatment, things that really couldn't stop during the pandemic that people really continued to need to go to their doctor for. Second was the sort of two areas around food access, which was deliveries of food, as well as bringing people to grocery stores and other essential shopping trips, as well as transportation needs of the homeless, workforce transportation for essential workers, and then there were a small amount of other trips as well. So the urgent program ended in June 2021. And in late 2020, we opened the application cycle for our next round. The second round was not restrictive to types of trips or populations. We opened it up to say, whatever the grantee needs, you can apply for, with a preference for COVID-related needs. So for this second award cycle, that was due. Grant applications were due in November of 2020, and we reviewed them over the winter. We made decisions in, I believe, January or February 2021. So awards totaled 2.4 million to 46 grantees. Again, this was statewide, and we opened up this one to include nonprofits in addition to the other eligible entities that we had in the first round. And as I mentioned, the types of trips and population served was not restrictive on this. We realized in our urgent grant that there were a number of needs that we hadn't accounted for in the urgent program, and that also new needs that developed in this new program. For example, vaccines were not something that were even a possibility during the urgent program, but they became something that people needed, as well as more social trips, more things related to getting out of their house, as well as adult daycare and things like that were also things that we were requested in the application cycle. So this is a map of where our current grantees are for the current grant round, which will end at the end of December. We are open to extensions, but at the moment, most of our grantees are ending in December. And so as you can see, they pretty much span most of the state. We have grantees that cover larger regions, including RTAs, as well as nonprofits. And then we have some individual municipalities as well. So for the 2021 grant program, most folks started in April or sometime in the spring. And so it's been about 6 months that most of our grantees have been running their programs. And so far we've had nearly 37,000 trips or deliveries. We've served over 17,000 individuals, and we have 136 partnerships with taxi delivery and hackney companies throughout the state. And as you can see, the breakdown at the moment is kind of similar to what it was in the urgent program. We're seeing a lot of need for non-emergency medical trips, trips to and from senior centers or adult daycare centers, meal deliveries, grocery store, other essential shopping, food pantry deliveries. So food and medical appointments are still a really high need. It's still a high use of the taxi grant so far, as well as workforce transportation. And every 2 months, we ask our grantees to fill out reports to us so that we know how much money was spent, what types of trips they're taking. We also ask qualitative information as well. And so you can see here, we ask folks how satisfied they are with their grant program. And so far we have about 85% are extremely satisfied and none are dissatisfied. We have 89% of the grant program is seen as extremely important in addressing issues in the community arising from COVID-19. So even though the state of emergency has ended, we're still seeing a really strong need for a lot of these services. And 86% believe the grant program fills transit and delivery gaps very well, and 14% said somewhat well. And so these are a few stories. I won't read all of them to you, but we do receive a number of different types of stories about how this grant program is working for folks throughout the state in our regular reporting. So you can see in the middle there was one person who mentioned that until they looked at the data, they didn't realize how much food they had actually delivered in their community. And it's really incredible when you see the vast impact of what our grantees are doing with this funding. And some of them have very little funding and some of them have a lot of funding, and the impact that they're having on our more vulnerable populations for food access, for seniors to get to essential places they need to go, for essential workers, is really having a big impact on on our communities throughout the state. So what's next for the program? As I mentioned, our current program is set to end in December, although we're potentially considering extensions through March. And we are starting to plan for our next round of grants. Our next round of grants, because it's based on a fee from Uber and Lyft rides, will be significantly less. As I'm sure all of you are aware, Uber and Lyft rides significantly decreased in 2020. So therefore the fee also, or the total amount of money that was acquired through that fee also decreased. And so we're working on that right now, and we're hoping to release the second round of grants either at the end of 2021 or at the beginning of 2022. Also noteworthy is that since the state of emergency ended in June of 2021, I'm sorry, that municipalities now have to follow 30B again to do procurements. And but they didn't have to under the emergency procurement. And so we are thinking of how we can be helpful as the regional planning agency to do a procurement for taxi and livery services so that our municipalities do not have to do a separate procurement on top of applying for this grant. So we're working on that now. We're hoping that that procurement will be live either this month or early November. So if you know of taxi or livery companies that would want to be part of this procurement, please definitely either reach out to us or let them know that this opportunity is upcoming. And like I said, we're planning for our next round of grants sometime this winter. We're hoping to release those and have a better idea of how much money we'll be able to facilitate in this next round of grants. And I believe Sandy might have just put the link to the partnerships page. Thank you, Sandy. If you have any questions about this, feel free to ask them now. You can also reach out to my colleague Travis or I. My email is mholland@mapc.org, and Travis's is tpollock@mapc.org. So I'll open it up for any questions if that's okay, Sandy.
Yes, please. Are there any questions? All right, Franny Osmond has a question in the chat. Call me opportunistic, but I'm curious about the 2/3 of money that mass development gets to support the taxi business. Does that sufficiently benefit the riders ultimately? How is that program used and how's it going?
So we do not operate the mass development program, so I can't comment on too many specifics. I know that some of the things that are being funded through the business support program are things like new dispatch services for taxi companies, new equipment, things like that a taxi company might need to purchase, like capital costs, things like that. I can't speak to how the program is going, but you can certainly reach out to Mass Development if you have more detailed questions about that program. And Travis just put the link to that program in the chat for anyone who wants more information on that.
All right, and Susan Barrett from Lexington wants to know if MEPC does the procurement, who will handle payment to the vendor?
So basically our procurement is also serving as a pre-qualification. So the individual grantees will still handle all the sort of day-to-day relationships with the taxi or livery companies. So the any billing will go directly to the grantee, which may be, again, a municipality or a regional transit authority. And the contract that will happen will be between the grantee and the taxi and livery company, not with MAPC.
All right. Any other questions? Again, you can put it in the chat. You can raise your hands in the participants menu. Travis has his hand up. I can. Somebody want to unmute Travis, please? And then we'll do Travis and then Susan.
Well, yeah, I don't have a question. I just wanted to, just mention a couple things in terms of like our RTAs, just to give a couple examples of some of the partnerships. So Franklin RTA is using, and this is, by the way, on the website. You can see this on the website. You can contact these RTAs. But like Franklin is using it for second and third shift workers, for transportation, for places, for times FRTA does not operate. CADA is working with nonprofits for essential services and work trips for locations and times when CADA doesn't operate, and for out-of-town medical trips where COAs, typically couldn't do that. And then GATRA is using it for long-distance transportation to hospitals that are outside of their service area. So it's a way for the RTAs to expand services without whether both by terms of span of time and also geography for places that they, maybe as a way to do that without, having to go out and buy more vehicles or something like that, to create these partnerships. And then I think what we're seeing from some of our grantees is they're using the data collected to then find ways to see, like, where are these trips requests and where are they going? And then if it might be more beneficial to use some other service besides the taxi partnership, if it looks like that there's a demand for certain places in terms of origins and destinations.
All right, thank you, Travis. Somebody could unmute Susan, so I'm sure she's got a question.
Thank you. Thank you. If my question is too detailed, I can do it offline, because I know I've bothered Mara and Travis a lot. But I am curious. So with this procurement, if you all have the procurement and the individual entities aren't doing it themselves, it sounds like we all would still enter into a contract, however, with specific vendors. Is that correct? But maybe there'd be more like standardized rates.
So part of the procurement, we're asking for price proposals. So all the folks that are applying for the grant will be able to see those price proposals and be able to kind of compare across taxi and livery companies. So I don't know if it would necessarily be standardized. You would know ahead of time like what the pricing is. And we are asking the taxi companies to project a price that will be valid for the full period of the grant. Does that answer your question? Oh, can someone unmute Susan?
It looks like the answer is yes.
Okay, great.
All right, thank you. And then we have a question from Rachel Fichtenbaum. Maybe I was interested in any insights MAPC might have on what's working well and what's challenging from your viewpoint, watching all of these grantees.
Sure. So I think as far as the program goes, a couple of things that we've seen challenging are marketing the program and really getting out the word that this exists. I know a lot of our grantees have fairly limited capacity. And so, in addition to doing sort of their normal position and then taking in calls on a regular basis for taxi rides, and then thinking about marketing the program and getting out the word, that has been a challenge to think about how to do that, how to have the capacity to do that. We've had a couple grantees do some really creative things, like send out a notice with a utility bill, as well as put it in the local newspaper, put it on social media, include it in a local senior center or an area where their targeted population visits frequently. So that's been, I think, a good aspect that folks have been trying different things and sharing what works. And we've shared suggestions out to the group as well. I think another challenge, I guess it's almost a good challenge, is that some of the taxi companies are becoming so busy that some of our grantees are having trouble having their rides met, which is both a good and bad thing, because we want everyone to be able to get where they need to go, but it's also great that the taxi companies are getting the business that they need to sustain their business and to grow their business as well.
All right, any more questions? All right, seeing none, thank you, Mara and Travis. Everybody at MAPC, it's a great program, and I think you're getting some compliments in the chat as well. So we'll move on to start to wrap up this meeting. First of all, are there any public comments? Would anybody like to comment? I see Jim Gascoigne had something in the chat, which I will read for everyone here. General question for the group: are there any policies and/or programs to address recruitment and training and career retention of CDL drivers? This issue was large even before COVID, and there are clear indications it's likely to be a persistent and burgeoning crisis. Jim, I have something for you. Just hold on 5 minutes and I will announce something. But I'm sure other folks will have answers to that as well. You can put those in the chat. I'm gonna give it another minute, see if anybody has any public comments. Again, you can raise your hand. If you're on the phone, you can dial *9, you can put it in the chat. All right, so just move on to closing and a few next steps. So first, I really just want to thank all of our speakers and my various colleagues who helped pull off this meeting, Tegan for helping to open it, and Roisin and Matt for helping run the meeting logistics, and of course, Michelle, Paul, and Matt for their presentations. Before we want to wrap up, if we can go to the next slide, Matt, I do want to mention what we'll be doing next. We'll continue to hold these big transit working group meetings roughly quarterly, so you can expect one in January or February. But between now and then, we'll be reviving the series of smaller one-hour coffee chats we began in the spring. These are informal virtual events centered on a particular theme or topic, and usually capped at about 20 to 30 attendees. We'll be announcing the full slate soon, but for now, we have on the slide a sneak peek of the list of topics that we're talking about. We have one scheduled for medical and human services transportation providers on Tuesday, October 26th at 4 p.m. The invite for that will be going out very soon. I'm going to try and put as many of the Zoom links for these as possible in the post-event email, Zoom registration pages. Tentatively, Monday, November 8th at the same time, 4 p.m. We'll do one on closing gaps between transit services. We did hear demand, as Jim just raised, to hear about strategies for confronting the driver shortage, and we are intending to have a discussion about that. I do not have a time picked out yet, but Jim, I'll get back to you, and we can talk about when would be best for you since you have a particular interest in this. We're going to work with the MBTA Regional Rail team, Rail Transformation team, to put up together a coffee chat about improving transit station access to commuter rail stations as they're modernized. We want to do one on COVID recovery planning, and we're also open to numerous other ideas. You should feel free to shoot me an email or even put in the chat now if there are any other topics you'd like to see. And we're going to aim for doing one every other week or so probably, and that'll cover a few months, and then we'll see how it's going. Any questions about that? All right, so move on to the next slide, please. We'll be sending out a post-meeting email, which I've already mentioned several times. It'll have links. It'll have a link to a feedback survey about the meeting. The recording of this meeting will be posted on the YouTube page, and there will be notices about future meetings. Next slide, please. Finally, if anyone has any questions, ideas, or thoughts they'd like to share, we're showing my contact info on the slide. You can reach me at sjohnston@ctps.org. Don't forget the T, or 857-702-3710. So I think we're going to wrap up a little bit early. If anybody has any last points they'd like to make, feel free. Otherwise, thank you all for coming, and have a great afternoon here in Boston. It's a glorious evening, and I hope you all have a good night.